Alright, it's New Year's. New Year's resolutions. What resolution? 4K. No! Resolution has nothing to do with any of this. However, my New Year's resolution is I want as many of us as possible to have a proper color pipeline like the big boys. So, a proper color pipeline for film can be a kind of complicated thing, especially if you're trying to do visual effects, because not only do you have to understand like what the camera's giving you, that data, and how it's being translated, and how to grade it, and all of that, but you have to know how to take like stuff from CG land and bring that in and make it somehow match the footage. So you have to understand what everything is kind of doing. And if you worked at like a big visual effects house or some post house, there'd be a guy who'd come over and be like, hey, don't worry, like we've already figured out like a good system for this. And so you do this, just do that and it'll work. Worry about the creative stuff. But most of us don't have a guy, which means we've just been like Googling and finding weird suggestions from the internet from somebody who may or may not know what they're talking about something that may or may not be applicable to our actual situation. And we found some kind of things to do, and we're just like, all right, I'll just kind of do this forever. But a lot of it's mostly just eyeballing, because we never figured out the actual right way to do it. And so we're just tweaking everything by hand, matching the black levels and like the white balance and all of that. And what that means is that we've spent more energy tweaking everything to match for a result that is less accurate than if we just figured out the right way to do it to begin with. And the reason we don't do that is because we don't have a guy, except for the past year, I've kind of had a guy. Nathan Vegdahl has been staying here in the workshop for the past year, and he actually understands color and all of this stuff, and he's quite clever. He actually, for fun, has been programming a spectral path tracer. You know how Cycles, bounces all of that light around? Well, Cycles only does that in red, green, and blue, and it combines those to form, white light. It's the same way our eyes see. We have the, I think, cones to see red, green, and blue, and it mixes all those, and the way they interact lets us see, full color. Our monitors only show red, green, and blue, but there's certain spectral phenomenon that you don't get if you reduce the entire visible color spectrum down to red, green, and blue. And so when Weta renders out like a monkey they want to comp into their footage, I bring up Weta a lot because Nathan brings up Weta a lot, because while it's impossible to have like a perfect color pipeline, they do it probably the least wrong it's possible to be at this point. But when they render out like a monkey, they're using a spectral render based off of the camera that was used to shoot that shot. They do a spectral analysis of the camera sensor to see how it responds to every part of the light spectrum, and so it's all as close to physically accurate as possible. And that's what we wanted to do. It's hard to do a full spectral analysis of your camera, but it turns out with the right tools, you can actually get most of the way there just by mapping the luminance response of the red, green, and blue channels. And those right tools are what Nathan Vegdahl has been making. He's also been working really hard to make a video series that basically lays out everything you'd want to know to be your own, color guy for your production. IDTs, linear transforms, color spaces, and gammas, and all of that stuff that usually makes my brain buzz a little bit. He actually goes through and explains in order. Most of the things I know about color and all of that are because at some point over the past 15 years, he sat down with me and explained like, hey, look, this is how it works. And having that knowledge to draw from makes it so much easier to make informed decisions when I'm trying to troubleshoot stuff, when I come across it. And so I'm very glad that other people are going to get the opportunity to learn from Nathan too. So why is this important? Well, the number one issue I see when I'm looking at like Indian hobbyist CG and compositing is people not looking at reference. But after that, it's people not having a proper understanding of a linear workflow. They just take the footage from the camera and work with it as is. I've had a lot of people send me links to shots they've done where they're trying to put like a green screened character, a green screened element into a CG environment, kind of like that Caitlin riding the elevator shot. And all of them are really cool, but most of them, the footage doesn't totally gel. And it's because the footage looks kind of like low contrast, and you can see they've tried to grade it to kind of make it match, but it still doesn't totally. And that's because they never properly linearized the footage to make it match the linear environment of the digital world, which means they're trying to key on like this desaturated footage in the wrong color gamut, and you're making your life so much harder than it needs to be. A proper linearization workflow will open so many doors. So check this out. I took an HDRI of my office and I mapped it onto a LiDAR scan, and look at this. It just looks so much better than the iPhone texture. And it effectively spreads the HDRI out across the entire room, so it's simulating the entire space instead of just a single point of the HDRI in the center of my office. Then I motion tracked this shot and lined it up with the scan so it's projecting back onto the 3D LiDAR scan. Now normally in a case like this, you could have the footage cast light on the object, or the object cast a shadow on the footage, but it's pretty darn tricky to do both, to go both ways. Nathan came up with a way to calculate out the light so it's in perfect equilibrium, and so you can have things casting shadows and bouncing light back onto the geometry. This is my new favorite workflow ever. It's going to be so good for complicated digital extensions. I will definitely be making a video about it later. So this will be the video where I explain how to get all of this stuff set up that I'll probably refer to later, and there will be subsequent videos that'll talk about all the fun stuff, like how to use an HDRI in the footage and how to get them to match so you can use the HDRI to perfectly light whatever is in your shot, or the importance of putting a small white piece of paper next to whatever you're photo scanning or like taking a picture of, so you can use that not just to set the white balance, but also the luminosity of whatever it is you're trying to capture, so it can be the right brightness in the scene, because that's a lot more important than you might think. Or I think I've talked about this, but the ability when you do a photo scan, you're baking in the environmental lighting. Like if it's more bright over here, you're baking that into the model. But if you take an HDRI at that same location, you can use that to divide that original lighting out of the model and just have a lighting-free flat model that you can then stick into whatever digital scene you want, and it'll get that lighting instead. Or like, here's some great footage of Nathan dancing with the balls. You go, oh, that's cool, they had some chrome balls, except what you don't know is I added this whole thing because it's a photo scan implementing a proper color workflow, and that's the type of stuff I'm very excited to start talking about. And yeah, I am laying it on a little bit thick here, and I apologize, it's just the process of setting up a proper workflow isn't exactly fun, and so I'm just trying to establish up front why it's definitely worth it. So maybe you've heard of a linear workflow and you think it's probably complicated or something, but it isn't, because the world is linear, light is linear, your understanding of light is probably linear, your vision is not linear, and neither is the footage you shoot, because the camera manufacturers are trying to cram as much data into as small a package as possible. So they're skewing the data to match your non-linear vision and getting rid of the stuff that they think you won't notice. Log footage, or logarithmic, is an extension of that, combined with a way to expand the dynamic range of your footage where stuff can get lost in the shadows and blown out highlights. And the trick is to undo that skew to make it match reality. So more than a few of you, I'm guessing, you import your log footage straight from your DSLR and into the compositor or Blender or whatever, and you go, okay, well this is obviously not right. It's too low contrast. Well, that's easy to fix. So we'll just put this in here, and no, that wasn't enough. Well, now all the blacks are crushed, but like the mids still seem kind of low contrast. Maybe it's like too bright or something. No. Let's try like RGB curves. Yeah, and I've heard of like a filmic S curve. Maybe that can kind of help us out a little bit here. And hey, this is looking not quite as bad. Or maybe you're really smart and you know that what you have to do is pull this down this way for some reason. And now suddenly, oh, okay, well that's linear. Like the light values are looking more linear. I mean, this is just, a guess, but it's still the wrong color. So you try to put in some saturation back in there. And okay, well that's looking pretty good. But this is just eyeballing. This is like multiple layers of eyeballing and nudging and just kind of thinking like, yeah, this is probably what stuff would look like, right? I spent 15 years, even worse than this, trying to composite linear CG elements into log footage by like just adjusting the black levels and trying to line everything up by eye and like, tweaking things, and it was a nightmare because I'm working in two different gamut profiles without even realizing it. Okay, so let's delete these. And what we do now is we just go down to color space and oh look, it's my A7 III. Oh, and this is actually what it looks like. It looks desaturated, but that's because that's the world I live in Seattle in the winter. This is a color space specifically calibrated off of my camera, and because now it's linear, we can like, here, let's put in a mix node here, and I'm going to multiply this by like 3. And this is what things would look like if it were 3 times brighter, or if we wanted to be like, hey, let's say only, 20% of the original light. And this is, we're going out of the dynamic range, but it's translating everything correctly. This is very exciting. Also, this is all just data, and once you linearize it, you can translate anything to anything. Like here, let's have it go back into my A7 III. So now the footage is being imported as log. In Blender, it is being treated as linear, but as we save it back out, it'll be rendered back to the original color space. So for setting it off to like a color grader or whatever, you won't have tweaked the footage. Or here, let's simulate the theta. This is how this camera would have seen this shot. This is Nathan's little 360 camera. So where did all of these little pull downs come from with these different cameras on it? It was easy. Because of you guys here on the Patreon, Nathan's been able to spend the last 3 months building an easy to use tool to analyze your camera, linearize your footage, create LUTs, build HDRIs, and set it up as an open color IO environment that can be accessed from most any program on your machine. And to tie this together, the reason you have to pull the RGB curve down like this is because you're undoing the fact that when the camera saved the image, it pushed it up like this. And the reason it does this is because humans are much more sensitive to changes in dark values. And since the camera only has so much data to use, by pushing it up like this, it's effectively squishing the brighter values we're not as sensitive to and expanding the darker values so it has more space to put the data in there, with the knowledge that at some point you'll pull that curve back down to cancel out their curve and re-linearize the footage. But that only works if you know exactly what that curve is, and that's what Nathan's tools are designed to tell you. And now a lot of you are probably thinking about aces.
Aces.
No, we love aces, and yeah, there's a lot of overlap. First and foremost, aces is a set of color spaces, color gamuts, available colors, and tools for getting your footage in and out of those spaces. If you've ever seen this image before, this horseshoe here represents all the colors that humans can see, and different image files can use different color gamuts, or color spaces, which are basically coordinate systems mapped on top of that horseshoe in the form of this triangle here, representing red, green, and blue. The sRGB color space, which you've probably heard of, is the color space of JPEGs and most monitors you use, and you can see it exists very comfortably inside of human vision. It can't replicate every color we can see, but that's not much you'd miss. The ACES color space is much bigger. It encompasses a really high percentage of the colors we can see, which is nice. And there's another ACES color space that's even larger, all the colors humans can see and more besides, but it's not as intuitive, so it's basically just used for storage. There are lots of good color spaces out there, and using ACES is a great color gamut to get things standardized. If you want to use it, it is right here in the pull down. We'll get to that in a second. So that is kind of the broad strokes of ACES, and when people talk about the ACES workflow, they're primarily referring to the list of IDTs provided by the company. IDTs are input device transforms, and it is a transform, those specific curves we were talking about, that will transform the footage from your ID, your input device, into the ACES, like linear color gamut, which is really cool. That's what we want. Unfortunately, those color curves, while they're very cool, they don't know your specific camera. They don't know all of your camera's quirks. It's kind of just like what they're telling the sensor to do. The biggest example of this is the black levels. So the ACES curve for my A7 III overestimates the noise floor, so it just lobs off the dark values and crunches the black levels, and considering humans are pretty good at noticing weird black levels, that isn't ideal. Nathan's tools will let you do that though. Like say you want to combine Sony's official luminance transform for your camera with a specific analysis of your camera sensor's black levels, with the red, green, and blue channels all analyzed independently, because you know how sometimes you're trying to composite and it seems like the black levels have like some magenta or green in there? Yes, takes care of that. You can combine those with the official curve and it just works great, and it's so cool. Or let's say you're using a really weird camera and you can't find a transform listed anywhere. You can actually put data into the program. It'll analyze an appropriate linearization curve and you can use that instead. And this is the nerdiest I've ever been in my entire life. Let's keep going. And I know what you're thinking. Ian, is that lasagna beyond you? Yeah. Alright, and after that 12-minute intro, how do we actually do this? First, you're going to go to the Eat the Future Image Tools page, and Eat the Future is just kind of the umbrella term for where we're going to be dumping all of the different color tools that we, mostly Nathan, come up with in the future. And you can see a bunch of his like to-dos and things coming up in the future. I think you can leave comments and do bugs, note bugs and stuff if you happen to find them. But we're going to go over to releases here, click on this, and pick the one for your file system. And if you're on Windows, it's gonna say, whoa! And that's because it has a zip file in there, which has a bunch of Blender color data in it, so you can get the original like Blender color profiles and stuff. But that's also apparently how people pack viruses. But we've sent it through like 20 different virus scanners, and just Windows download is the only one that's like, wait a second, it's fine, it's fine. Nathan did not put a virus in it. This is the part of the video where I show you how to unzip a file. And here we go. Okay, there's 3 programs in here. There's the LUT Maker, there's the Open Color IO Maker, and there's an HDRI merge. Because it turns out once you've made a LUT Maker, you've secretly also made an HDRI merging program, kind of. It's really useful. I use it quite a bit. So let's open up the LUT Maker. And here we go. This is it. So there's kind of three things you have to deal with to get a nice profile of your camera. There's the black levels. You want to get that all figured out. There's the luminance transform that we were talking about, and there's the color space, the color gamut. And this kind of lets you mix and match however you want. Right here, there's bracketed exposures. In fact, how do we want to start here? I'm going to start by calculating everything. So first right here, this says what type of image you're dumping in. First, I'm going to dump in, let's do the lens cap images, and this is going to get you your black level. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're not getting any light in the camera whatsoever, and just pop off a few pictures. Ideally at the ISO you're going to actually be shooting at, because that can have a bit of an effect. So these are mine. It's literally just 5 black images. Put them in there. And it's analyzing all the levels as you import it. And now let's go over to bracketed exposures, and that just means pictures at different shutter speeds. And you do want to change the shutter speed, not the ISO, to get all of these different exposures here. But you just basically take a picture, change the shutter speed, take a picture, and try to get all the way from like really bright to really dark. So you map that entire range. And with that set to bracketed exposures, we dump it in. Again, it analyzes all the pictures as it's imported. What's fun is you can actually do a bunch of different sets, and the more sets you do under more situations, the more accurate it'll be. There is kind of an amount of diminishing return to that, but it's fun to be able to, I don't know, harvest more data in that capacity. And you can either click Add Image Set, or just every bundle you drag in will be considered its own set. So if I just do this a second time, now it's importing Image Set 2 down here. And with that all in, I'm gonna just click Estimate Everything, and there we go. If I want, I might set this up to like 5,000, just because it's fun to watch it all wiggle around. But this is now the curve for my camera. And if you're kind of wondering like what it's doing here, every time you take a picture, there's a little bit of data that's saved with that picture, the metadata that says like what the ISO or the shutter speed is. And LUTMaker is using that as the point of reference. It's going, okay, so at this shutter speed, these are what the values are. At this shutter speed, this is what the values are. And it's able to extrapolate, the response and the curve out of all of that data. And we could just export this as is, but let's get a little bit more advanced. Here, let's pop this open. So right here you can see it's actually estimated these are the red, green, and blue levels for the black level. Sensor ceiling, Sony in particular doesn't go all the way to 1. It always clips at like 0.99. I think that's because for some broadcast standard that really doesn't make any sense to include, but they do. And here you can see the transfer curve, the IDT. This is estimated, but we can also select one if we know what it is. And also Nathan can add more to this at any time if they're needed. But I know I was shooting on Sony S-Log2, so if I click that, here we go. You can see now it's mapping. 0 to 1 goes actually 0 to 14. Blender's kind of weird in that capacity, where if you import anything above 1, it clips it off. So I'm just gonna click normalize here. Don't worry too much about this. And LUT resolution, that looks good. So now this is the official Sony curve with our custom black levels and all of that set up with our camera. And I'm just going to export to linear to a folder, my curves. I'm gonna call this, this is my A7 III S-Log2 with, I think my ISO is set to 800. Although again, I think we have some kind of fudge room in that regard. Yeah, alright. And just to clarify, like this thing's pretty flexible. Like if you want to use Sony's official curve and you just want the black level, you can just put in the lens cap images here and go over to advanced, estimate the sensor floor, and then pick, your Sony S-Log2, and you are maybe normalized, and you are ready to go. So you'd want to export a different LUT for each camera that you're shooting on, and each individual color profile, because the different color profiles have different contrasts and ways they process the footage. That's literally the whole point. I only ever shoot on my A7 III in like S-Log2, and so this is basically all I need. Sometimes I mix up the color profile if I'm shooting green screen or something for reasons that I'll probably get into later, but yeah, let's just run with this for now. Close this. Let's go into the OCIO maker. Okay, and what is OpenColorIO? It's a little confusing. No, it's not confusing. It's a color management system. At like big post houses, they don't go through and update everything on every single computer. They have like a central repository, and so OpenColorIO is a central repository. It's a list basically of all of the different transforms you want, all the different cameras or monitors or whatever, and you update that one file, and then every program can just reference that one thing. And so it's that central thing, but also a module. Like Blender comes with OpenColorIO already included in it, and so Blender will be like, hey, OpenColorIO, I need an A7 III, and OpenColorIO goes, okay, I got it right here. But you can also get plugins for Premiere and After Effects that do the exact same thing. And I should touch on this because OCIO isn't just a repository of transforms. It's an entire system that lets you go from, you know, footage, transform it into a workspace and back into whatever, you know, output format you want to go into, and it handles the entire thing, which means you can actually build an ACES pipeline within the OCIO template. And what Nathan's OCIO maker and the LUT tools let you do is just really get your hands dirty, tweaking the settings and you know, the color gamuts and stuff that you want to do for your workflow. Like the other day we were doing a bunch of systematic tests with my camera trying to figure out the ideal green screen setup. So we were exploring with all of the different color profiles and different color gamuts to see which combination resulted in the best resolution for green screening. And it turns out you actually want a smaller color gamut if you're shooting on a 8-bit camera, because it's 8-bit, it's like, you can kind of think of it as the resolution on that triangle. And so if you have it really big, you can like represent more colors, but it'll be lower resolution, where if you make it a lot smaller, you can represent fewer colors, but like at a higher resolution, which means you don't get as many of those jagged blocks around the subject you're trying to keep. And being able to experiment with combining like one transform function with another unrelated color gamut and putting them together and just being like, do that, is a thing you sometimes want to do that you can't always, like you can't do that with ACES. It assumes a very specific color gamut. And so it's just been very fun to be able to get our hands dirty and use the tools as tools instead of just using the options that we're kind of given. And this is a tool that lets you make that central configuration file. So let's get started. Right here, I'm just gonna add a new one, and this will be the one we just made, Sony A7 III S-Log2, and I'm gonna load it in. My curves, there we go. So this is the curve that we made that'll turn Sony S-Log into linear. If we invert this will turn things back from linear into Sony's S-Log2, which is how in Blender I was able to do the pull down and simulate what the scene would look like when it was rendered with all the different cameras. If you want to have those options appear in the pull down, just click Include as Display, and it'll include the inverted curve along with the original, which is pretty fun. The final thing here is we have to select the gamut. The gamut is that color triangle on the horseshoe that show, you know, what the exact values of the red, green, and blue and the central white point actually are. And if you're on any mid-range high-end camera, you're gonna have that information available, usually under the color profile settings. Like I know I'm shooting on Sony S-Gamut 3, which are actually the exact same gamut, but Sony's just being funky. But what's cool is actually you can see what all of those different spaces look like here, which I think is kind of fun. If you don't know what the gamut is for your camera, or if it's like kind of a cheapo or weird camera or something like that, a lot of times sRGB could be a safe bet. But again, most mid high-end cameras, it'll be available information. So this is what I'm working on here, and now we just have to create the configuration directory. So I'm gonna browse. Let's just create a new folder. This will be my OCIO settings. Yes. And export config. And it exports successfully. Let's take a look. My OCIO settings, and here we go. And the final step is we just have to tell OpenColorIO how to find that configuration file, which consists of creating an environmental variable, which if you've never done it before, it's very easy. Just Google it. It's slightly different, I think, for Windows, Mac, and Linux, although if you're on Linux, you probably already know how to do it. Just Google set up environmental variable, and it says right-click, go to System, go down to Advanced System Settings. Here's Environmental Variables, and the variables, literally, the name is just OCIO, and the value is, you know, you click New, say OCIO, and here's the config file. I'm gonna right-click on it and just I'm gonna copy this right here, although you can also copy this and just put in the file name, but let's go back. Poof. And if I clicked OK, that would be the variable, except I actually already have it linking to a different folder. But that's all there is to it. And then when you open up Blender, if I go down here under color management, under display device, I've got my A7 III, I've got the theta, I can have as much stuff as I want. And that's because when I was setting things up, I can add as many different color spaces as I want. I can load in, you can see like these are the curves we made. These are all the different cameras and settings that I might want, and I can just add, you know, the theta and say like, hey, this one's in sRGB. And here, I'll call this one theta, and this will be like we just did. This would be my A7 III S-Log2, and these would all just appear in here. Same with here. If I do like images as planes here, and let's load in this footage right here. Yeah, and here we'll go into the shader editor. And I'm just going to plug this directly into the surface. And if we go into rendered, we can see what we're dealing with. It's a little bit washed out. It's still in log, but if we go down here to my A7 III, it will be linear, but it'll also be a little bit dark. And that's because a weird kind of quirk. You remember how S-Log2 originally went from 0 to 14, but anything above 1 in Blender gets clipped off, and so we normalize it down to 1. But that means we need to re-expand it. This is just kind of like a weird Blender quirk, but we're going to multiply by like 13, and there we go. Now it's linear again. You can see it's actually like a little bit too bright now. The dynamic range is more than we can see, but if we change the exposure, we get those details back, which is really cool. It means you can shoot like a high dynamic range, you know, like S-Log footage, use that as a texture like in your environment, and you still have all the high dynamic range. Like if you have a lamp or something in your scene, that lamp will actually be emitting a more proportional amount of light in your video texture environment. We'll get to that. I think it's pretty cool. Also, Nathan has some node groups he's made that they can help you kind of normalize stuff and bring down the exposure so you don't get those really bright bits, and some like delighting nodes. But we'll get to all of that later. This has been a tricky video. It's hard to talk about OCIO and color gamuts and color spaces and IDTs and all of that as if it's like a natural thing to talk about. It really isn't. My tongue is tired. But I think this is gonna do it for a first video. There's a lot more stuff we want to talk about. This is kind of like the first stepping stone into getting into a linear workspace, which has just completely changed the way I think about light and CG and compositing it with footage. Having both the CG and the footage be linear means everything just like gets along so much easier. You can do math. You can add and subtract values. You can combine them in a way that just like makes sense and is really intuitive. I'm going to be releasing Nathan's video that he made, where he really gets into the nitty-gritty of why everything works the way it does, which I highly recommend if you want to kind of wrap your head around all of this stuff. There are still quirks that we're figuring out, and especially in terms of like how Blender and OpenColorIO integrate. Like right here, if I hit play, we get like, you know, 1 frame per second once it gets down there. But if we change this to sRGB, it plays back a lot faster. Why is that? It's because sRGB is such a known color space that I think they've actually optimized it so it can be used with the GPU, I believe, which means a lot of times I'll just, in the compositor, I will do the conversion, export an sRGB version of the sequence so I can get that real-time playback if I want it. Just a lot of weird stuff like that, but we'll get into that later. I think I want to get this video up. I wanted to get it up by Christmas, but I didn't. I will talk to you soon. Have a good one.